What is the effect of domestic violence on children, particularly as it relates to the court system? Do restraining orders immediately apply to children? How does visitation work? Does it impact custody? Basically, what happens when children are involved in domestic violence? This is Unsilenced, a JBWS podcast where we have real conversations about abuse. I'm MC Robinson, and today I'm speaking with Pat Barbarito, a lawyer who played an instrumental role in helping to develop the Battered Women's Legal Advocacy Project, and Maria Lagattuta, who oversees our Morris Family Justice Center. Before we get into this conversation, I just want to note that we are referencing New Jersey law in everything that we're discussing, so there may be some differences in your particular state or country. However, this conversation does answer many frequently asked questions about domestic violence, the court system, and children in general, but it is referencing New Jersey case law. That's our experience. That's where we are. Now, additionally, I do want to make something really clear before we get into this conversation. Since we are going to be talking about the effects of domestic violence on children, sometimes that's really hard to hear, especially if you're a victim of abuse and your children have been victimized or affected by witnessing the abuse in your home. I just want to be very clear that it is not your fault. The person that is causing harm, that's the person that's using abuse. It's difficult to leave an abusive relationship. And to blame the person experiencing abuse is really wrong. So we just really want to make clear that if you are a parent and you are being victimized, you are also a victim, right? Like that's important to keep in mind because too often when you hear the effects of domestic violence on children, you can internalize that to think that the victim, the person that's being abused, did something wrong, but they didn't. The blame lies in the person that is abusing everyone because domestic violence is a really hard thing to leave. So please just, before we get into this episode, this can be hard to hear about the effects on children, but be gentle with yourself throughout this. And remember, help is always available. I just want to take one more minute before we get into this episode just to remind everyone if you are not subscribed to Unsilenced, please do so wherever you get your podcasts because it really helps us to break the silence surrounding domestic violence. Okay, now please enjoy this episode. Today, we're going to be talking about domestic violence and children because a lot of people who are in abusive relationships do have children with those partners. And so I'm just wondering if we could give an overview of just how does having children impact domestic violence cases when they are in court?
That's a multifaceted question on so many levels because it impacts children legally, practically, psychologically. But let me talk about the legal aspect for a moment. When one applies for a temporary restraining order, which eventually becomes a final restraining order in most cases, the unique aspect of it is that the parent could ask for a restriction or suspension of parenting time. Now, think about this. This is an ex parte application, no notice. It is an immersion application. So many of the times, these children are going from an intact household to one parent missing, disappearing. Now, in the old days, the temporary restraining orders were finalized within 10 days, and statutorily that's required. In many counties, that just doesn't happen. There are adjournments, they're put off. So what really happens many times is a parent is removed from the children or the children from the parent for a period of 10 days, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So there's a very practical impact. Now, sometimes that's for the good. Sometimes they should be, and sometimes it just will really be very confusing to a child. So remember, the Domestic Violence Act is something that you get relief adult to adult, but the children are profoundly impacted. To get visitation or parenting time during that time is tricky. So there is a profound practical impact. We could talk about the psychological impact later because there's no contact and it's confusing. But on the other hand, you want to keep the kids safe. So it's complex.
Usually, just to
to take what Pat said a little further is a lot of times people will come for their first hearing and request an adjournment. At that time, the judge may also order some type of visitation, whether it's supervised or unsupervised, so that too much time doesn't go on. Again, if it's safe for the children. There are restraining orders where children don't end up, especially if they're older teens, like your 14, 15, 16, 17s, they won't necessarily put the kids as a protected party unless they were a party to what happened. The other piece, which is important to note, is that if children were present when a act of domestic violence occurred, the police are mandated to call DCP&P.
Well, that's a great point, Maria, because DCPP is a whole nother aspect of it. Judges are reluctant with serious allegations to order visitation, so they will usually err, usually on the side of protection. And one of the problems, and I'm trying to be very neutral in this conversation, is that many people, so let's face it, domestic violence is serious. Restraining orders are an amazing resource, but it also is a very sometimes overly used custody strategy. Not saying it's not legitimate, please. I don't want to for a minute minimize the import of a restraining order, but we see all the time where there is a marriage on the edge or a complaint for divorce simultaneously pending. A restraining order is the one way to tip the scales in terms of the best interest of the children. Because if you get somebody removed for 2, 3, 4 months, the chances are you're going to have an advantage in custody. And that's where it gets a little tricky. Do you agree, Maria, or what do you think?
Yeah, yeah. And when we look at what power and control looks like, sometimes, I mean, we see it in the power and control wheel where a partner will use children against the other partner. Like if you file for a divorce, I'm going to get the kids 100% of the time and you'll never see the kids. If you do this, I will keep the kids forever. So really using kids to manipulate a situation. And honestly, that's why a lot of people are fearful to apply for restraining orders, even if it's in the adult's best interest.
So let's back up for a second. When we are considering having a restraining order, let's say there's an incident of domestic violence that occurs and the party have children together. What does that immediately look like? So a restraining order is filed. You mentioned, and Maria, I'd love for you to kind of expand on this. You mentioned that kids are only a protected party if they are witness to the abuse. Is that the
Mm.
case? And can it extend if there is a history of abuse? What does that look like?
So usually initially, there's always exceptions to the rule, but usually if even if like a child is in a bedroom, but they were present, they will be a protected party to stay away from the parent who caused the harm. Um, that can be revisited usually at the initial hearing
Okay.
when the judge, right. So, but if there is a history of abuse, sometimes that child will stay on the restraining order until the final restraining order hearing.
Mhm.
Children do not get on a final restraining order. At that point, there's usually some kind of we're figuring out child custody, child visitation, but they don't normally end up on a final restraining order unless it's I think I know one case where children were on a final restraining order.
But Maria, even if they're not in the room, if there is such violence that the fear would be if the child was alone with that parent, that
Right.
alcoholism or drug addiction, they will be protected
They will, yes, initially.
initially. And then your job is then DCPP would come in or a complaint for divorce is filed if there's a marriage. And it usually the civil court or the family court will take over that issue. But the
Correct.
initial protection is through, I mean,
The restraining order.
and you can strategically keep an abusive parent away from children or protect children for a very long time through the initial application of a restraining order, if it's handled correctly. And that's where, Maria, I always find preparation of witnesses is so critical, and that's what JBWS does so beautifully. Um,
Mhm.
I know many times where people have gone and used JBWS as a resource. They are taught to write down their history, how to testify, and they do it beautifully because it's a lot of time, and quite frankly, lawyers charge a lot of money. So that resource, I hope anybody listening to this will take advantage of that because how you present your case makes all the difference. So if somebody goes to a judge and says, well, I'm kind of concerned, or is very specific about the abuse in front of the child, it will make all the difference. So preparation of a witness, and again with JBWS, is so important.
Mhm. Now, can you just say what is a protected party? Just kind of give that definition.
So the protected party is anybody who potentially is experiencing harm the from the defendant. So it could be the children. There are a lot of times there are family members of the plaintiff on that restraining order because they've threatened the parents. They've gone to the home where one of the parents lives. So anybody who is impacted by that abuse, based on the Prevention of Domestic Violence Act, it has to be like family members, intimate partners, roommate situation.
Mhm.
But anybody else who is affected by the harm that happened up here can be a protected party. Our survivor does need to ask for that. It doesn't automatically happen.
Preparation, right? So that's all part of it.
Preparation. Yeah.
But I think, Maria, it's important that people understand that to have the standing to apply for a domestic violence order, and I want to talk about the Victims Assistance Act in a minute, you have to either be dating over 18, married. There's all kinds of criteria. So you can't just apply for it unless you have the standing to do it. And if you don't have standing, you can't ask for other protected parties. Now, that's under the domestic violence law. As I'm sure you are well aware and use all the time, the Victims Assistance, VASPA, Victims Assistance Survivor Protection
Res
Act,
protection.
enacted, I think it was last year,
It was 24.
right, January 1st, 2024. The beauty of that is that was in reaction to the fact that if you are not in a relationship, not dating, no relationship is required for the first time. So in domestic violence law protection, it was. Now you can get a restraining order with no relationship, not living together, for sexual violence, stalking, cyber harassment. And the world has changed so much. So there are AI pictures, there are cyber stalking. This is the first time, and I think this is fairly, I say revolutionary, but significant, that somebody who is a victim of just plain old craziness, stalking, can be protected. One of the things that has been a big discussion, there was a case, I don't remember, it was last year in New Jersey, where somebody killed somebody, I think, on a bicycle, just
Yeah.
because there was an obsession with the person.
Mhm.
And VASPA would have protected them. However, this is where it gets interesting. If you're a teenager, maybe not. And that's where it gets tricky because a lot of stalking, cyber stalking, is young people, high school. So
Yeah.
really now the next step, in my opinion, would hopefully be that if it's somebody under 18, VASPA still applies for over 18, although there's some exceptions. When I was preparing and thinking about this, I was thinking back to the 80s, 90s after domestic violence law was put in place. There was no recording devices, there were no cell phone devices, there were no ring cameras. It was so difficult to prove cases. In many ways, it's gotten easier, but it's also gotten more complicated because there's so many more ways to abuse somebody.
Hmm. I think you also make a good point about teenagers and how, to my understanding, is it literally impossible to get a restraining order between teenagers? What is that information, Maria? Because I know there's been a big
So
movement.
if someone is dating someone over 18, so if I'm 16 and I'm dating an 18-year-old, I can still apply for a restraining order.
Right.
It's the defendant, the person who caused harm has to be 18 or over. But I can be 16, Like I can be a junior in high school as a 16-year-old dating a senior who's 18,
Hmm.
and I can get a restraining order. If I'm a 16-year-old dating a 16-year-old, I cannot. I can safety plan with a 15, 16, 17-year-old. JBWS does go into the schools and we teach about healthy relationships and safety planning and all of that. But that doesn't, and we know statistically, 1 in 3 teens report that they have had some form of intimate partner abuse in their relationships. 1 in 3 teens. That's a lot of kids. So how do we protect them from? So, I mean, yes, we want to teach them healthy relationships. We want to teach them to notice the red flags. But right now, there's no protection in place for them unless the person using harm is over 18.
And
So
that
if
is shocking to me because that is an area, and there's a tremendous amount of violence amongst young people in dating relationships. That's when when you're teenagers, when you are not yet emotionally evolved enough to understand breakups, when you become obsessive, et cetera, et cetera. So it's shocking to me, especially with VASPA, that it didn't trickle down to under 18, but it hasn't made it yet to that thing. But that's a huge issue, teenage abuse.
It's a huge problem. And the fact that there's almost this sense of feeling like there's nothing you can do. And I think that that hopelessness is really tricky. But I also think it's something a lot of people feel when relating to the court in general in some of these cases, when we think about even the children of people who are impacted by domestic violence. You know what I mean? Like a lot of times it kind of doesn't feel fair.
What we often don't talk about is the unbelievable impact upon kids who are domestic violence victims. I mean, when you talk about the psychological impacts and the everlasting traumas that they bring to the next generation, that's when everybody's alarms should be going off because this is not a one generational thing. This is a cycle that causes behavior complications, physical health complications. They are not able to get into healthy relationships, and the cycle goes on and on. That to me is the biggest cause for concern.
we do our trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which is an evidence-based therapy for children who have experienced trauma. Um, and yeah, what you're saying is how do we change the world? How do we recognize that?
Hmm.
Because we are dealing with generational patterns. And when we're seeing those patterns, how do we decide we're going to change that? Hopefully, if we're getting them early in counseling, hopefully, if we're teaching the masses about healthy relationships. But a lot of times people are afraid to call it out. We talk about this. Oh, it's the neighbors, I'm not going to call the police.
Yeah.
It's not my lane.
Hmm.
That's not my lane. How do we make it our lane? How do we say, no, this isn't okay? So being able to even teach our children from, having our children learn from our mistakes. Yeah, I screwed up. I don't want to see this happen to you.
Hmm.
This is why I'm making the changes that I'm making.
So if you are raised by a low simmering abuser, you marry one sometimes, or you become one because it's familiar to you. So I'm wondering, do you see the therapeutic intervention as impactful, or is it just inevitable that there's going to be issues?
If people want to change, they can change.
Yeah.
It is hard. And I will tell you, I do therapy and somehow I always land with the people who are in an abusive relationship who ask, how did I get into this? And we discuss how they got into it, but we also discuss how can you change it now?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it is hard work to step out and do something different. I 1,000% agree with you because it doesn't feel familiar.
Hmm.
I talk to my clients all the time about what homeostasis looks like. I may be working with a 7-year-old who's the identified issue in the family, and then they get better, and then the 10-year-old starts to act out because we want to keep this homeostasis. The more we start to change, it's going to be those baby steps. The
Yeah.
more we can do that work, it may not be dramatic, But if we can do those small steps, hopefully, then we do change the next generation.
The
Definitely.
other thing is that with regard to children or young people, I'll say, there's such shame having a household that is either aggressively violent or low level violence, such shame. They're not talking to anybody about it. So not only do they not talk to anybody about it, but they evolve with such shame in their lives that inevitably their ability to function and attach and form a healthy attachment um, approach is not or healthy attachment style is not going to be because they don't talk about it. They're embarrassed. They isolate. They don't have friends over. They don't. They know instinctively something's wrong, and that creates a whole nother level of issues.
I think
I
that's
agree.
also the purpose of the podcast like this. I mean, it's literally called Unsilenced because I don't think, and I'm not saying you're suggesting this, but I don't think there's this like fatalistic view of like, if you grew up with this, this will continue. And I think that's where JBWS's work is so important and education about abuse is so important because it allows for the silence to be broken and for you to reflect on what's happening. And so then, because we do have an abuse intervention program, which I know I mentioned, where we work with people to identify the core issues that lead to their abusive behavior and where they even felt that it was okay to start abusing someone in the first place. Because those frameworks are really they're implanted in people at a young age. And so we work to undo them. And I think that even if you are initially attracted to this, this is how people end up in these situations, unfortunately. But I do think through our counseling program, through our residential programs, through our abuse intervention programs, through education, so that people can hear these conversations and be like, oh my gosh, I am perpetuating the cycle of violence, or I am, choosing a partner who is treating me like my father treated me and or something like that, then that is the first step. It's like the first seed of hope in turning your life around and changing. So that's kind of what I think our orientation is, Maria. I don't know if you would agree.
Mhm.
And I could not agree more. I
Yeah.
think that, but it's so interesting. The one of the things I've learned in my life at the ripe old age of 69, I've been doing this for 45 years, is it takes a long time to speak out and be
Yeah.
unsilenced about things that are shameful. I always say this all the time. I was married for 17 years. I had a difficult end to my marriage. I have a podcast. I talk about this all the time. I don't care anymore. But it takes a long time to be able to speak out about things. And I'll tell you, it is the best therapy in the world.
Yeah.
Because you get to that, I don't give a heck anymore. But you know what? I don't know about you. It took me till I was probably in my 50s to be able to be at that point in my life. So getting back to being silenced and unsilenced, being unsilenced, in my opinion, is the cure for all of life.
Yeah.
But people are so afraid of being judged, of being shamed, and it's so brave. And I don't say I was early on, you know, um, to speak out and own it and have a little sense of humor about it, quite frankly, which I do. It's really hard. So I think speaking about it is the only way we're going to ever get through this.
So, in terms of shame, I think the more we can educate, the more we talk about it, the more we identify that sometimes this is hard stuff to talk about. I know when I do therapy with little kids, I wrinkle my nose a lot. But but you know what? It doesn't mean you're broken. But let's talk about it so we can keep you safe. And I think the more we can do with our dating abuse prevention program, the more we get into the schools, the more we talk about it. Because I think what happens when we do that is kids can recognize themselves. Oh, that's happening in my family.
Yep.
Oh, I see that with my friends. And I say this to a lot of people, we can talk about the statistics that, oh, oh, there's more cases of autism or more people have ADHD. We have more education now. We talk about it more. And I think the same is true with domestic violence. We're talking about it more. We're educating people more so we can recognize the signs and symptoms sooner. We
Yeah.
can
When you
recognize it a
go into
little bit
school,
earlier.
when you go into schools, Maria, do you think kids are responsive to this? Or do you think it starts peeling back the shame a little bit?
I think it starts peeling back the shame a little bit because they are starting to talk. I have two teenagers, and sometimes I hear what they're talking about, and I'm like, we did not talk about that when I was in high school. Um, But I do think that the more they're exposed to it, the easier it is for them to later talk about it. And if we have our parents, we have to also bring it up to them. We have to say, hey, I'm concerned about this. This doesn't feel right. I'm worried about, it feels like you're not hanging out with your friends. The more we can have those conversations with our kids, whether it is parent to child or as part of a curriculum like our ADAPT program,
Yep.
the more kids are talking about it, and with I'm seeing it with kids.
Yeah. I've
How
worked a
about
lot with with our dating abuse prevention program, which is the program Maria was referring to that goes into the schools. So I'll work with them on materials and stuff like that. And I will say, like, the way they do it is really ingenious. So it starts when they're 12 in sixth grade, and they found the foundation of it is healthy friendships. So it's like how to identify. So they are really genius. I'm gonna plug them. But they're be on the podcast a lot. But the way they start, it's not like abuse, 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 abuse. They're like, this is how you should be treated. So then there's the inherent flip side is I'm not being treated this way. And so people have come back and like they've gotten really incredible responses where people have said, I didn't know abuse happened to people under 40. Like I thought that they were married and they had to have kids together. And it's like, no, it can happen when you're a teenager. So just that knowledge sometimes is enough for them to talk amongst themselves. So I will say, I think one of the things that we do well here is education from a young age so that there is less shame, so that they are able to say, like, my boyfriend, maybe they use language like, he's super toxic or she's super controlling, but getting that language and getting them to talk about it, I think is a real strength of that program. And that speaks a lot to them.
JBWS does a lot of things well, but hearing about these programs, which have evolved tremendously since my involvement with them, to me is probably the best resource because again, it's talking about it, it's
Yeah.
unsilenced,
Yeah.
as you said.
Yeah.
To me, this is unbelievable that these resources are available to people to
Yes.
have a conversation. You
Yes.
know, one of the other things I think happens to children, if we're talking about victims of domestic abuse, is sometimes children think they need to become the parents, the
Yeah.
rescuers. And if we could just talk about that for a minute, I think that is one of the dangers that I have seen with families that when there's either a low simmer abuse or an obvious abuse, young people, especially the teenagers, feel that they have to rescue the family, be teenagers. That
Yep.
can have its own, I'm sure, Maria, you could talk about the psychological damage to a child. So, in some ways, you want a young person to be responsible. On the other hand, you want to say to them, you can't fix this. It's a very delicate balance because there's nothing wrong with them being responsible. And I think that's another consequence of domestic violence. Children are not able to evolve in the way that they should. But, there are many circumstances that cause young people to not have a childhood. This is just one of them.
As we talk about it, if a person who has kids is listening, I also want to make sure we're not making them feel ashamed because they're also victims in this situation. And it's hard because it's like hearing this is a negative effect on the kids, but it's not your fault that it's a negative effect on the kids. It's the
We've
abuse.
got to talk about it.
Yeah, and
It's
it's
got to
the
talk
abuse that is being inflicted to you and your children. Like you are still a victim or a survivor, however you want to see it, but it's not like you are doing something wrong. And I feel like that's where a lot of people who are victimized will internalize and think, "Oh my God, I'm causing so much damage to my kid." It's like, no, no, you're not abusing them. The person using abuse is causing the damage. Like, do you agree, Maria, just with that caveat?
Yeah, what I was gonna say was a lot of times kids they want to protect their parents, but there's this thing called split loyalties. I love both parents. And who do I pick? And that puts kids in a really difficult position. And what I hear you talking about, Pat, is that idea of parentification, where the child kind of becomes the parent. So our hierarchy, where we want the parents on top, the kids on the bottom, it gets all sorts of mixed up and messed up.
Yeah.
So, hey, let's say, someone harms my mom. I'm going to go take care of my mom and protect her. I've put myself in a parental role, in a protective role. Or I'm in the middle of my parents because they're fighting and they're saying that I can't love the other one, but I love them both and I'm very confused by this, which causes that internal turmoil. Like, but if I say that I love this parent, then this parent is going to be upset with me. So really, for parents to understand, kids love you both. They
Yeah.
love you both. We can acknowledge that the behavior is not okay, but that child still loves both human beings.
How do you feel about this? And I've struggled with this. At some point, do you say to a child, I have to take responsibility that I made a bad choice in my marriage? I think you certainly could be a victim, but I think there's a point where you say to a child, we're talking about children, to teach them, I made a bad choice, and I'm really going to figure out therapeutically why I made that bad choice. I've talked to parents about this for years. It doesn't
Mhm.
make you the bad person, but it makes you take responsibility for marrying somebody who was damaged or inappropriate. How do you both feel about that?
The choice implies an ownership, which implies fault personally, because here's the thing that happens with abusive dynamics. Nobody's willingly entering into them. Do you know what I mean? So like you are a lot of the times love bombed. So you are thinking, "Oh my
Yes.
God, this is the best relationship I've ever been in. Nobody's ever
Yes.
treated me so well. This is fantastic." And so then a lot of the times these people get into these relationships, they're like kind of hoodwinked into
Yes.
staying. And so then they're not in their idea making a bad choice because what they're doing is thinking, "Oh my gosh, I'm being treated so well." And so these things start slowly, right? So like you have financial control that could look like, don't worry, like I'm going to take care of the finances. Like I'm the head of the house. It's okay. Like I'll protect you. And so all of a sudden, it's like this, and you're deep in here and you have no ladder to get out. So I think incurring responsibility on the victim personally, uh, adds to the shame because it implies that they knew this person was a certain way and willingly decided that's who I'm
No,
going with.
no. I'm not suggesting. I'm suggesting that if you had had I had the tools, had I had the psychological sophistication, I would have examined these things and understood it. No, obviously, nobody willingly gets into a
But
abusive
I don't
situation.
think they know. Like, I don't think they would be able to really see because a lot of times abuse also starts in these very subtle ways, Maria. Kind of, it's like,
Yeah.
you know, all of a sudden, like for some reason, they're in a really bad mood and I'm going to try and make them feel better by doing this. And then it's like, okay, that worked. Now they're a little better for a week. And then, okay, they're kind of being weird about this. Like, but you start to have an idea that, like, oh, this makes sense. Like, they just don't want me to go out with this person because they feel jealous, or there's these little things where you rationalize and rationalize. And I think when it escalates to a certain point where there's violence or severe verbal abuse or something,
Yep.
you're already like latched because that's like part of the thing with abuse, right, Maria? Like they keep you trapped,
Yeah.
like whether that's you have children together, whether that's you're financially dependent, whether that your housing is responsible for them. I think it keeps you almost like taped to them. I don't know. What do you think, Maria?
There was a movie, it had Blake Lively in it, and it
It ends with
has one.
us.
It
It
ends with
ends
a
with us. Thank
Yeah.
you. It really does show that initial attraction where it is fun, it is flirty, it is nice. He's trying to protect her and
Yeah.
okay, it is a movie. So it's no, it's very it doesn't go super deep,
Right.
but you see how his behaviors change.
Yeah.
You see how she makes a decision. And it's for her, it was easy to say, no, I want a divorce. I want this. I want better for my daughter. I want better for our daughter. What would you say if she came to you? Now,
Instead,
again,
yeah.
but you see how it turns. You're already involved in this relationship. You're already together. It didn't start out that way. And that's where I think what I hear MC saying about choice. Sometimes, like, yeah, I made a choice based on the information that I had.
At the time.
And then it changed.
Hmm.
Do you think if people were more educated about red flags? I'm just asking you. If people were more, I certainly growing up, red flag, nobody talked about anything,
Yeah.
our generation. But I think if you were, I mean, I'm so focused. I mean, I have two daughters, 27 and 34, and they're like, all right, already, we get it, the red flags. But I say you have to be mindful of this issue because they're subtle sometimes. They're red flags, but they look beige. You have
Yeah.
to be really aware of them. So when I say take responsibility, I'm talking about looking back years later, saying, now that I look back,
Yeah.
I did it in my own marriage. I see that there were, and it was not an abusive marriage, by the way, it was just other issues. I see that there were red flags. I was too naive
Yeah.
to understand what they were because I grew up with dysfunction. So I didn't understand that was dysfunction.
Yeah.
So I think educating people about what red flags look like, what unhealthy looks like, I didn't know because I grew up with unhealthy parents, marriage. Then you become aware. And I have said to my own children, I did not understand this. I now do.
Yeah.
It's a gift, and I own that. I think that's
Mhm.
the difference.
No, totally. But I do think a lot of people do talk to their children because I think that that is one of the big things is like, don't fall for grandiose behavior. It's not really romantic when they're calling you 47 times in a night, and I
But it
think,
feels good if you're lonely.
yeah, exactly. No, exactly. But see, that I think, you know, there's so much shame for obviously it's a lot of times mothers that they got into this situation that they're putting their kids in this situation, and I think what we also want to show is like it's not your fault, but to your point, I do think like if you are noticing this and recognizing it, educating your kids and saying this is the problem is a good thing. Like you can use what you went through then to hopefully spare your kids from repeating that pattern. And that's what we're trying to do, right? Is like interrupt the intergenerational cycle of violence and have something where it's a pause of like, I'm not going to go down this road. Like I'm realizing, sure, I grew up with this way. This is what I'm like initially attracted to, but I'm actively choosing path B and going towards something that maybe feels less exciting or whatever, but I know is healthy. And I know it's healthy through this education where they respect me, they're not obsessed with me, like I can have other friends. So I think, these conversations are really important because people hear themselves reflected in it. I think it hopefully empowers them. Do you want to add anything, Maria?
No, I'm agreeing with you
Do you
100%.
have, are
Yeah.
they ever angry, Maria, about the victim? In other words, sometimes kids get angry at the person who's the victim because that victim reported it and disrupted their family. Do you see that at all?
I have seen that in just some of the individual work that I've done, which goes back to what we talk about split loyalties.
It's heartbreaking because not only you're a victim of the domestic violence, you're a victim of your kid feeling that you're responsible for breaking up their family. And it's very sad.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And Robin talks about this. Robin is the head of our crisis response team and domestic violence response team. But she talks about the willingness to have to endure your kid being mad at you for a while for safety
Yeah.
and how painful that is and how difficult that is. Because she'll say, like, yeah, like a lot of times, I mean, one other tactic people who are using abuse use is they trash talk the other parent, right? They're trying to make them seem like, see if mom didn't do this, like I'd be able to live with you and tuck you in at night.
Right.
And so they use that manipulation and control. So children are very susceptible to that. And obviously you're going to listen to like what your parent says, and especially if it's constant negativity. So there is this, I mean, this is kind of what I was referring to earlier with the how unfair it is. Like these victims are experiencing this and their lives have to change. They have to be so affected by the abuse and control and manipulation of their partners, and then there's not much else they have to do but endure it. And so I think that's why getting connected to services, I mean, I guess this is kind of a whole conversation just about services, but getting
Oh, it is.
connected to those services, the counseling groups that we have, other people, men and women who have been abused can come together and talk about these exact things, issues with their children, issues with their spouses, and then rebuilding their lives because domestic violence is one of those things that cuts you to your core and in every facet of your life. So what we're asking when people listen to this and they recognize this is to rebuild in a very difficult way, which I don't know if you would agree, Maria, but it's a very difficult thing. But we also still give them the tools. And I think that's important.
But also bringing it back to the beginning of the conversation, Memsi, the one thing that also I think gets forgotten is if you get a restraining order and the other parent, the father, for example, is prohibited from seeing your kids, it's no picnic to be with your kids 7 days a week, 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
So now, not only are your kids upset, perhaps, that you got the parent out of the house, but you are, and I don't mean stuck. We all love our children. You're working, you've got to get them to softball practice and football, whatever it is. You've got to take care of them 24 hours a day. So you no longer never have another set of hands. That's no picnic. So this idea that I got protection comes with a lot of consequences.
Yeah.
Got to put them to bed every day. Got to get them to school every day. Who's going to do the other driving? Who's going to do the errands? It's a lot of responsibility when there's not another parent in the house.
And also just to, when we do education, when we go out into the community, we talk about like, how do we break the question of, well, why didn't they leave sooner?
Yeah.
And we
Yeah.
go through that whole list of why, let's stop asking the question. People don't leave because of fear, because of finances, because of, their kids.
Practical consequences.
One thing I'm just going to go back real quick to the restraining orders. The last couple questions, I just want to ask who should be notified of a restraining order when they have them in place? And who should someone call if those restraining orders are violated by the abusive partner or the person using abuse?
So if the children are on the restraining order, this and they're school age, the school needs to be notified. The local police will know. If they go to a faith-based community, where both partners go to church regularly or mosque or synagogue, those places should also know because if they're doing religious education classes and they can't be with that other parent, the religious education program needs to know that, hey, this parent cannot pick up the kids.
Right.
So the school, maybe sports teams, anything that is going to impact these kids should know. And if there's a violation, they need to call their local municipality or the municipality that the violation occurred in. That is really tough for a lot of people, but it is up to the local police department to take that report. They cannot come to Superior Court and report it. They need to go to their local police department.
Interesting.
Even if the violation, again, this is where it gets tricky. Well, he just called because he needed his suit for work. See, that's where, so people are like, well, I don't want to call. And then that's used against them when they go to
Yes.
court.
Yep.
Yes. Yes. That's
Yes.
important. So you should report.
1,000%.
Unfortunately, like, so how many times have I heard people say, well, I don't want him to have a problem with his job. So I met him to give him his suit. First thing you say when you go cross-examination, didn't you meet him last week? You couldn't have been too afraid.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
But you understand why they don't want to make a big deal about it. I don't want him to lose his job.
Yeah. And it's easier sometimes to just be like, okay, I'll just do this. Like,
Yeah, right. I don't want to fight. I'm tired. I don't want to go to the police department. I gotta, feed my kids.
yeah. Yeah. And also, if he loses his job, maybe that's a source of
Yeah.
income that you're missing out on as well. Like, I mean,
Well,
this is
that's
why,
why a
yeah,
lot
go
of
ahead.
restraining orders get converted to civil restraints. They come out of the domestic violence courts, and there's a lot of conversion to civil agreements. So there's no job consequences many times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing I just want to, if somebody is thinking about turning a temporary restraining order into a final restraining order, is there anything somebody that's experiencing abuse should consider as it relates to kids and co-parenting? Are there certain barriers that are more difficult with a final restraining order? How is that kind of navigated? Because if a victim has a restraining order that does not apply to the kids, is there
The
anything that they
final.
should consider or be aware of in that situation where if they have a final restraining order against the parent of their children, what should they just be aware of that brings?
Well, with regard to custody, there are significant impacts on custody. So generally, it will get tossed to the civil courts, but as a parent entering into a final restraining order or a court ordering one, you have to be real mindful that whatever order is made with regard to the kids will carry forward and be very impactful on your future custody arrangements.
Yeah.
So it's a strategic game as well.
Well, what we find is that a lot of times, if there is a final restraining order and they're following a visitation schedule, they'll do drop-offs and exchanges, like either curbside, if the child is old enough to like walk to the car, or at a police department because there's cameras there. And we've had people either do it in the parking lot or do it in the waiting room, depending on like the age of the child and someone's comfortability, or they'll send a third party to do the exchange. So that can be difficult too for kids and families.
Do you
One of
have,
the things that people sometimes forget at the time of the final restraining order is, instead of saying, well, we'll deal with that later, or I don't want to deal with that, it's really important to address that issue because it's going to be a while before you get before a family judge. And that's a problem. So if you've not addressed it, you've got a problem because you don't get, remember, the Domestic Violence Act is set up for emergency intervention. Nowhere else in the courthouse do you get emergency intervention. If you have to wait for a family judge, you can wait weeks and months.
yeah.
So it's really good to be smart about using that opportunity to have some structure put in place and uh, not address that issue.
Are you able to use a court mandated app if you have a restraining order? Like, does that work, or are you only allowed to, you can?
So there's something called Our Family Wizard. You do
Yeah.
have to pay for it, but it is a way. A lot of final restraining orders will allow for non-harassing communication about the children.
Okay.
And that's usually the language on that final restraining order. A lot of families will use this app called Our Family Wizard, which you do have to pay for. There is another one, which I believe is free, but there's um, Pat, you can probably speak better to this than I can, but it's semi-monitored.
I'm not familiar with anything other than Our Family Wizard, but many times people stick to just electronic communications, text or emails, and no verbal. So there's always a record of it.
Right.
And you're right. Most times there is an ability to talk about the children. It's a fine line though, because
Yep.
if you have verbal communication, you're not constantly sitting there with your phone on recording it, which you're able to do. Things have progressed so much. Years ago there was no recording devices, so it was he said, she said. Ironically, we always used to say, well, it's he said, she said. We don't use that anymore because people are always having recording devices on. So it is a different world, fortunately, I think, because it
Yeah.
makes things clearer.
However, sometimes someone will instigate the other party and then they act a fool and then they record it and they go, see, she's the crazy one.
And
Yeah.
very, I always say people make people crazy. So, when you bite the bait and everybody does it, and you look at that action isolated, it can be used against you. And I've seen situations where the victim breaks and freaks out, and that's used against them, as opposed to saying, no, he made her crazy, and she had a momentary lapse.
Yeah.
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 And people set people up.
That's actually an episode
Mhm.
we want to get into in the future is the idea of mutual abuse and reactive abuse, and kind of covering that. So the only last question I'll ask, if somebody is listening to this, has children, is in an abusive relationship, is thinking about going to the courts, getting a restraining order, what would you say to them? It's a message, maybe of encouragement or advice. What would you say?
Obviously, the exception is if there's a gun to your head or an emergency, you call obviously immediately, you don't think about anything. However, if you have time to prepare, and often we do because there's always a triggering event, I would suggest a few things. One, prepare, prepare, prepare. Go to a service like JBWS, write down the history of abuse and bullet points, have it with you ready to go at the trigger, always. Prepare, prepare, prepare. Have some money in your name or credit card in your name, something so you have some resources.
Yeah.
Prepare, prepare, prepare. Have backup plans for your kids' transportation to school or whatever. Be as ready as you can be. Obviously, if it's an emergency situation, you don't have that luxury.
Yeah.
But prepare. That would be my advice, to prepare for the practical consequences of somebody being removed from your house so that you don't intensify the trauma.
And I think that whatever event leads you to decide that you want to get this restraining order, you're braver than you think you are. I always talk about fear and courage live right next to each other.
Yeah.
You can't have one without the other. So even if you're in that moment of fear and you're like, I just got to do this, I got to do this, there is courage in, I got to do this. So remember, you are a lot more courageous than you think you are.
It sounds so clinical. Get a restraining order. He's abusing you. She's abusing you. People are attached.
Yeah.
They feel that they're hurting somebody they love. Many
Mhm.
times. It's hard
Yeah.
I know this person's, I just had a call with somebody this week, a history of abuse, but she knew his vulnerabilities and she was attached to him. So to call the police and break him killed her
Yeah.
because, she didn't want to hurt him. She understood he was a victim of abuse, whatever. So it's not that simple to
Yeah.
call the police on somebody that you love, that you nobody marries somebody that they didn't have some good times with,
Of
don't forget
course.
that. So,
Right.
forget that. So we think about those attachments and that love, and it's hard to do to somebody you care about.
Thank you, Pat and Maria, for this conversation. It was something I personally knew very little about, so I found it very educational, and I'm really certain it's going to help a lot of people, so thank you. As a reminder, please remember that if you are a victim of abuse and your children experienced it, it is not your fault. You are all victims in this situation. And please remember that help is always available. If you're in Morris or Passaic County, New Jersey, JBWS is here. There's a lot of resources linked in the show notes and at the end of this episode to help, regardless of where you are. But support is out there, help is out there. Please know that it's okay to seek it when you're ready. Please tune in next time to Unsilenced to learn more about all facets of abuse because education is the first step in ending domestic violence. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unsilenced, Real Conversations about Abuse. This podcast is produced by JBWS, a domestic violence agency that serves both Morris and Passaic County, New Jersey. If you would like a certain topic covered on the podcast, then please send an email to podcast@jbws.org. We are always striving to provide content that will be both educational and helpful to our listeners. But please note that this email is only intended for content relating to the podcast. It is not meant to offer immediate assistance or any access to services. If you live or work in either Morris or Passaic County, New Jersey, and think you might be in an unhealthy relationship, then JBWS is here to help you. Please visit jbws.org/services to learn more about programs for support or call our 24-hour helpline to speak to a member of our staff at 1-877-782-2873. If you're listening to this podcast and recognize controlling or unhealthy behaviors in yourself, then JBWS can also help you to change those behaviors. Through our Jersey Center for Nonviolence, JBWS offers programs for men, women, and teens who have used abusive or controlling behaviors. Please visit jbws.org/JCNV or call 973-539-7801 to learn how you can stop the cycle of violence. If you don't live in either Passaic or Morris County, then please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Since domestic violence grows in silence, you are helping us break the stigma associated with domestic violence and supporting our efforts to unsilence those impacted by abuse. Please be sure to subscribe to Unsilenced, Real Conversations about Abuse, wherever you get your podcasts, and follow JBWS on social media to get as many people talking about abuse as possible. Thank you so much for listening and helping us to break the silence around domestic violence.